to read something by a piece by a writer named Jane Tompkins because I think it's so interesting. Do you know this piece? That I think you do.
I think I do.
But because I think it's important. He was taking on such large issues in such an interesting way, and Jane Tompkins says, Stowe was an actor in one of the most profound changes in gender relations in the course of American history, the influx of white middle-class women into the nation's public life. In their roles as writers, as teachers, as editors, and as reformers, post-revolutionary and antebellum women entered civil society in astonishing numbers. And she says, the popular domestic novel of the 19th century represents a monumental effort to reorganize culture from the women's point of view. And this body of work is remarkable for its intelligence, ambition, and resourcefulness. And in certain cases, it offers a critique of American society, and then Tompkins says, it's far more devastating than anything delivered by Hawthorne. So I
Those
think
scribbling women.
those scribbling women. So I wonder if we want to engage with that at all, the idea that could this novel, it seems to me a novel that by needs had to be written by a woman at that time. There's a certain part of it that could have only been written by a woman, and I wonder if you feel that at all. Any of you?
Oh, I do for sure, because one of the things she's really interested in is domestic power relationships. For example, Mrs. Shelby is better able to run the farm in Kentucky, but she doesn't. And so Mr. Shelby gets into debt and has to sell his favorite slave, Tom. And Mrs. Shelby resists telling him, resists taking charge, but once he dies, she gets it together and brings things together. But that's true all through the book. The women straightforwardly address the issues, sometimes only to their spouses, but other times through organizing things around the house, or through addressing issues to other people, and through acting. And in that sense, I think it's a book that could only have been written by a woman because she's very sensitive to domestic arrangements. And one of the things that struck me in the first time I read it was the way she portrays households in Vermont, among the Quakers in Ohio, in New Orleans, and in Simon Legree's house. And she was extremely influenced by her sister Catherine, who wrote this great book, the gist of which was, Catherine Beecher, the gist of which was, if you don't take charge of your household when you get married, young woman, you will soon be dead. And yeah, and she meant through childbirth and overwork. And so Harriet was very influenced by Catherine's educational dynamism in this book that Catherine wrote. And so a lot of this book is about, okay, how do you arrange your household so that it works, so that it doesn't kill you?
Well, she wrote another book on that topic.
Oh, she did.
Yeah,
An earlier one.
the arrangement of the household.
houses.
She came from the women's magazine world, which many sort of anti-slavery women had started out there, like Sarah Hale, Lydia Maria Child, Emily Catherine Pearson. And also internationally, you know, the revolutions in 1848 sort of had an effect. And we have these sort of Margaret Fuller running around. And a lot of this literature was international. There was a black woman named Charlotte Fortin, the only black writer Edmund Wilson mentions in Patriotic Lore, who in 1852 was part of a sewing circle in Western Massachusetts that was reading George Eliot as it came out. She disapproved of Jane Eyre, but you know, these things there was more discussion and circulation among women, you know, through poetry in their magazines than we sort of now recognize. And this is very much, I think, a part of that. After the Civil War and after the defeat of Reconstruction, there's a huge kind of reaction. And all these women who had been excited at Seneca Falls with Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony and all these people were completely frustrated by the end of the 19th century because all the radicalism that had been promised on the eve of the Civil War was simply wiped out and suppressed. Women didn't have the vote. Even some of these early feminists turned against sort of blacks because theoretically black men had the vote, black brutes had the vote, but not middle-class white women. But this was part of this kind of women's radicalism. And in the book, the agents of everything, of every sort of radical message are women.
Yeah.
You know, and the ones who take the radical actions are women.
Yeah. I was just saying, there's a subversive stream, and I was just trying to find the quote. Mrs. Shelby is definitely subversive. She resists everything that her husband says in a very quiet and discreet way that's not going to break up her marriage. But
sure, honey.
yeah.
Just to have
but
made a
she's-
black family a copy of her own
Oh, she's
was in itself.
definitely, she's a voice of benevolence and of humanity and of humanism. And then later, I can't remember which couple, it's the couple, he's a senator in Ohio.
In
Ohio. He's a state senator in Ohio, right across the river where Eliza goes.
And they're talking about taking in runaway slaves, and he says, we can't possibly do that, my dear. I just came back from sitting in the House of Legislation, and we just passed this, and I can't be party to it. And she says, sweetheart, supposing the door opened and there was a young woman there who was shivering and cold and destitute, you wouldn't shut the door, darling. And he can't answer her. And so you have
this happens in Stoves twice.
I'm sure, but this happens throughout the book over and over, and it is a very strong message for women and by women, and it is the voice of subversion, the domestic voice of subversion, and it's not bringing flaming brands to the barricade, but it's saying women understand this in a way that men do not, and what he says,
and that they can act. They don't just have to understand it.
And they take a position. And what he says is, dear, you don't understand this. This is a larger public issue, and a great deal of money is at stake. And she says, you cannot shut the door.
But also, I think Stowe got the domesticity of slavery right. We always think of Tara and Gone with the Wind and huge big houses and hundreds of slaves. And most slave establishments were small farms where people were living together in rather close proximity. And so she got the scale of slavery and how domestic an arrangement it was, I think. Exactly right. All the more remarkable because she really had no experience of the South. Everything comes from conversation and reading.
It's interesting because I had no experience in medieval Greenland either. I mean, that's what a novelist.
Always right.
That's what a novelist has to do.
Exactly.
Has to learn, and quite often, because you're a novelist, you are a novelist because you learned a lot of stuff from reading. You learned a lot of
It's a
stuff
real
from
world.
literature.
Yeah.
And so that I always say, you aren't necessarily original, you're just a volunteer for whom that river of literature passes through.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's because you're better at processing stuff that you read or eavesdrop upon or you hear than you are in a way at processing stuff that you observe.
Well, the question remains, though. I had two reactions as I was reading this book in the last month, two kinds of reactions. One is I was people looking a little bit askance at me as I was riding in the subway reading.
That's because you had a book out.
Oh, yeah. That's possibly true, Darryl. I think so. Or I wasn't listening to Ned on my headphones. But, and the other reaction, so we had the reaction of people who seemed to be looking askance at the book, and then people who just said, oh, I never read that book. Oh, I wouldn't read that book. Why would I read that book? Isn't that a terrible book? And why read it? Isn't that book has done, I mean, people said, who wants to read a book that put the stereotype of Uncle Tom into the world? And I find that very interesting because we're talking about her this is a book that, in some ways started the Civil War, and you could argue that it did, in some ways, and it was a large part of an influence on it. But also, I mean, it's a book, as you're saying, about subverting power in all kinds of ways. Women and men, the slaves and their masters. So why does it get such a terribly bad rap?
Well, could we just look at the gender of the people that have given it such a bad rap in the 20th century?
Alec Baldwin, James Baldwin.
I'm sure Alec, I think they should have Alec on the panel. I think we can definitely.
I think women, I think she is, I mean, I really do think there's a gender issue here. And that
You do?
Yeah, I do. I think she's, to have a voice that is so powerful. It was the second most popular book in the 19th century. And it deals with emotions and domestic issues. And I really do think for that group of intellectuals, that was a threat. And I think
But
that's
I also think that it was pirated so many times and made into popular shows and
That's true.
Theater.
productions, and you know what we today we made into T-shirts, but you know then it was crockery and plates and stuff like that. And what do we do? What do we know about pop culture? It goes for the most sentimental, the cheapest, whatever it is, and it glosses over all of the intelligence in whatever it is that it picks up. And I think that happened to this book. And so, you know, I'm going to say that I do think, I'll say two things. I think this should be required reading in 9th grade in every high school in America. It's a page turner, and they would read it. It is really interesting. It is way more interesting in my view than Crime and Punishment. As just a page turner about America, you know. The other thing is that so if people read it as young people, they would not be able to have this many layers between them and it. There's many layers of gossip and hearsay between them and it. The other thing I would say about it is something that I've forgotten. So you go ahead. I'll say
I'm
about
trying to
it.
let you remember.
I will remember.
I think that, you know, the Tom shows and what happened and the theater pieces that she had no control over what was done with the characters or anything like that was part of, you know, this kind of cultural repudiation of these radical messages from the abolitionist era. Lydia Maria Child was saying in 1878, it's amazing how everyone wants to forget how it's all sort of gone. And you know, after the Compromise of 1876, when the Union troops went away, you know, a kind of slavery was restored in the South, and all these kind of, you know, there's sort of always the romantic legend of the ruined plantation owners, but actually they got property and all this sort of stuff back. And the obsession in fiction from 1876 to the First World War is still about the South and race relations, and especially interracial dating. These were books coming again and again and again, and they all sort of have Mrs. Stowe in mind. We don't remember any of them. It's the landfill of American literature. Got all these books that were this kind of long reaction to the anti-slavery works before the Civil War have sort of been forgotten. But even in The Klansman by Thomas Dixon in 1905, he has as his characters many of the characters from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and he pays her back by sort of, you know, dealing all of them a very harsh fate. And that's the novel from which D.W. Griffith took and made Birth of a Nation. So the whole thing, you know, this long reaction to this book and to the Civil War and to the rights of black people buried this book along with it.
Yeah.
In 1916, there were a record number of memoirs about the Civil War from the Confederacy. There were 75 published that year alone.
Wow.
So, you know, this was sort of pressed down, suppressed in a way, except on the black side of town. Someone like Charles Chestnut, he modeled his whole career on what she'd done in Uncle Tom's Cabin. He tried to write about the New South in as honest a way as she'd written about slavery, hoping to make as big a sensation and as much money. And he failed miserably because nobody wanted to hear it.
Right, nobody did.
Do you, Roxana, think that every ninth grader should read it? I'm for anything that gets Lord of the Flies off the ninth grade. I wonder
Lord
what-
of the Flies and Crime and Punishment, there's room for them.
But what do you think?
No, I do. I think it, as Jane says, it has a wonderful narrative. Kids that age would be able to identify and internalize.
They would not say Eva.
No, probably wouldn't.
And they would internalize it in
But
a
I'm a
way
bad
that
person.
wouldn't bring them into.
Sorry.
That's okay. You got it.
No.
No, keep going, internalizing the characters and bringing them into.
They wouldn't bring them into opposition to the intellectual naysayers who came later. If you read it in ninth grade, you read it for the story. And it's shocking, and you get that, and it makes you cry, and that's important. And it's important that kids should know this about this country.
But it's I'm not gonna, I have no opinion in this statement, but it was a powerful instrument. It did something, the way a lot of books don't do something. And so, but even at the time, there was some question about the literary quality of the book. And I just want to read you a quote from the New York Daily Times in June 1853. This is a very positive review of the book. Mrs. Stowe undertakes the expose of the abuses of slavery, and her first object is to show how the internal slave traffic works. She selects some incidents to illustrate this. In every case, the same exaggerated style prevails, and in every case, it appeals to our sensibilities in the most painful way. We are not in the least degree disposed to find fault with this method.
Well,
So-
Darryl was just saying that she's actually suppressed the cruelty of the system. And so I think what this is evidence of is that in the North, they didn't even realize how cruel the system was.
Or wanted to deny it
Or
like
wanted to deny it. And so, so in some sense, she's this mediating figure who makes it more horrible than Northerners are willing to admit, but less horrible than she and almost everybody else knows that it really is. But she forces it into people's consciousness.
And realism was a real battle to establish in American literature. And people were against realism because women read novels, and they felt women shouldn't be exposed to realism.
Like childbirth.
That's thrown me off track. Now I'm thinking about childbirth.
That just caught me.
Oh, I think if we're talking, he's not actually complaining about the literary quality. He's admiring it. I mean, I think that the literary quality again is confused and obscured by the piety in it, which really kind of keeps on intruding. But I think what for me is lacking, I think she does all these things that Jane talks about. She's incredibly ambitious. This is a monumental task to bring this issue to the reader in a way that will make the reader weep and understand it. What she doesn't have, what this book does not have, and which I'm sorry to say my family does not have, is a sense of irony. This is the most earnest book in the history of writing.
No, I don't agree with you. Okay.
No, I
I
certainly needed it.
Right?
She needed this drive.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying she didn't need it. I'm just
No,
saying
but I
there
think
is
she
an
has
irony
a
in it.
sense of irony. I think that the book is full of passages where you know that she is playing with you. Specifically these passages where she likens the behavior of a particular slave to behavior of politicians in Washington.
She
And
has
so that she has a great
It's a
variety
sense of humor.
She has a sense of humor.
And Aunt
I'm not saying
Ophelia
she doesn't
is
have
all
sense.
these New England women
Yes.
that she was sick of.
Yeah.
She definitely understands what she's doing. I'm not saying she doesn't know what she's doing. I just mean that a deep sense of irony is not what this book is about. She's much more earnest and exhortatory than she is ironic.
It is, I think, really religious, because
Yeah.
if you know, William James talking about conversion and hypnosis and mesmerism and varieties of religious experience could be describing Tom, you know, in a way, because he converted at a camp meeting and then says things like, oh, no, I can't find it, but if we suffer with him, will we not also reign? You know,
Yeah.
things like that.
But-
I think
but
it's
I
a very
mean,
religious book in that way,
Can we,
which doesn't admit irony very well.
can we in 2012 in America read a character like Uncle Tom and perceive him in the same way that we can perceive Billy Budd? Is it possible,
I think
given
so. I
our,
don't
given
see
our
why not.
history?
Let me say one more thing about literary quality, and that is that there are two voices that she has. One is the narrative voice, which is fairly earnest with occasional ironic asides. The other voice that she has is the voices of her characters, and she's really very good at letting her characters talk in what seems to be their own voices, and their voices are very. It's like a chorus of different voices, and she's exceptional at that. And so we forget that she has created these characters too, in addition to the narrative voice, and that they are also speaking for her. So there's a kind of liveliness and inventiveness about the voices of the characters that I find of great artistic quality. And so I don't, you know, I read all those Dickens books to do the Dickens biography. Our mutual friend and David Copperfield are not the only books that he wrote. He also wrote some real crap. But he is forgiven that. They forgive him for that. Even our mutual friend, well, that contains no crap, but David Copperfield contains a little measure of crap within it. But he is forgiven.
Sorry.
He's forgiven his A Tale of Two Cities. You know, a measure of crap within A Tale of Two Cities. And yet he is forgiven that because he is beloved.
And you think she's not?
I think she's not forgiven
No,
for crap.
you're right about that. But this is the best book she wrote, and the others that I've
I'm not
read
saying.
are truly crap. But I haven't read all of them. The other thing is the James Baldwin and the protest novel. It remains one of the things in his work that I can't explain. I understand why he wrote that about Richard Wright. I don't understand why he wrote that about Uncle Tom's Cabin, especially since he read it 9 times. And he did, you know, sitting in the windowsill, and I think it comes with his own.
He read it voluntarily.
He read it over
9
and
times.
over again. That got his mother worried, and she tried to take the book from him.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think that as a young critic, he was getting away from his own storefront religious background
Maybe, yeah.
and really minded how religious the book was. And not to mention, you know, just deciding that he's a different, freer person than Richard Wright was, and he could sort of write, you know, make art.
But maybe he
Sort of-
learned from all the voices in here. He learned.
Well, his own fiction is more like hers than Henry James.
But,
In the end.
I'm going to say the thing that I had forgotten to say before,
okay, Jane.
because I remember what it is. I think in good times in this country, this book seems extreme to us. But the ways in which the issues that she addresses in here, capitalism, religion, racism, power relationships, male-female relationships, regional differences, and education. When this country that we live in begins to fall apart, it still falls apart along the same fractures. And so her analysis of how these things work may not have seemed particularly up to date to me during the boom years of the 1990s, but now it does. And I think that that's a reason that I would put it into schools, because it's not about the good years, it's about the bad years. And the same issues, are constantly interacting in this country, the ones that I just listed. And she was the first one who basically put her hand right on all of them and said, you must look at these and
Pay
think
attention.
about them.
Pay attention.